I remember the morning my mother started asking me to try on her clothes. I was 15. She had been crying in her workroom for what I thought was no reason, but I understood much later that she had just dropped a stitch on a half-finished camisole and could not see, even with her strongest glasses, where the loop had fallen onto the carpet. I came down for breakfast, and she was sitting on the floor of the workroom with her back against the sewing machine, her palm flat against the spread of pale silk as if it were a small wounded thing, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said only that the world had started to go a little gray around the edges. I did not ask what she meant. I made her tea. I sat on the floor beside her. I did not know, that morning, that the silk would eventually end up folded into my own hands, that her hands would eventually end up shaking too much to hold a needle, that I would come to know the inside of her wardrobe the way I knew the inside of my own chest, or that the small promise she made me that week, just try this on, just once, just so I can see the drape, would become the quiet axis around which the rest of my adolescence slowly, strangely, turned. She had been a seamstress in our town since I was a baby. My father had died in a road accident when I was 4, and the workroom, the small back room at the end of the hallway with the long window and the wooden cutting table, had become both her office and her grief. She did bridal gowns mostly and promenade dresses and the occasional christening robe, but she was also quietly famous in 3 postal codes for the lingerie she made for women who did not want to walk into a department store fitting room, who did not want a stranger measuring their hips with a tape, who wanted at least one piece of clothing in their life to feel like it was made for them and not for some ideal size on a label. She took those commissions after hours. The good fabric she kept in a tall cabinet that did not lock because she said locks made her feel like she was running a vault rather than a home. When I was small, I was allowed to fall asleep under the cutting table while she worked, and I would listen to her voice narrate measurements to herself as she cut. Bust 36, she would say. Waist 28. Hip 38. Sleeve from the shoulder bone. 3 fingers past the wrist. The numbers fell on my head like a soft rain. I used to count them in my head before I could fall asleep. I had the impression, growing up, that women were a kind of architecture and that my mother was the only person in our family who knew the secret blueprints. My sister, Marion, was 4 years older than me, and she had gone away to university in the autumn of the year I turned 15. I did not realize, until she had gone, how much of the rhythm of our house had been her. She had been the one who answered the door when customers came to collect things. She had been the one who made my mother sit down and eat lunch. She had been the one who read out the post to my mother when her eyes got tired. With Marion gone, the silence of our house grew louder, and the silence of my mother's workroom grew almost unbearable, and I, awkward, watchful, slow to speak at school, began to drift down the hallway each evening after homework without being asked, and to sit on the tall stool in the corner, and to listen to her cut. I had not known, until much later, that my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who had married an engineer and moved to Lisbon when I was 7, had written to my mother 2 months before, asking whether, by any chance, my mother still kept the courage of her old talent. My aunt had been left in an awkward situation 2 weeks before her own silver wedding anniversary. The niece of a friend, a woman married in a hurry in a different country, had finally confessed that she owned so little for the wedding night that she had been embarrassed to even tell her husband. My aunt had remembered, almost from instinct, that her older sister used to make camisole number 4 with the small French seams and the ribbon tie at the bust. She had written, very carefully, in her slow formal script on lined paper, asking whether my mother could make such a set in ivory silk with small French knots along the hem, and whether, if she could, she might be willing to mail it to Lisbon before the end of the month. My mother told me none of this at the time. She only told me that her sister had asked her for a piece, and that she was worried she could not finish it well because her right eye had started to lose its sharpness in the late afternoons. I remember her saying, very quietly, "I've made 1,000 of these. I've never once had to think about whether the seams were straight. Now I have to think, and the thinking makes my hands shake." I think she asked me for the first time because I was the one who was there. I think she asked me because she was afraid. I think now, with the mercy of distance, that she asked me because there had been no one else to ask, and because she loved me, and because she did not yet understand that the asking would change us both. "Just try it on once," she said the first afternoon. "I want to see how the bodice sits." I want to see whether the ribbon lies flat. Hold still. She held the half-finished camisole against my chest with both hands the way she would have held it against a tailor's dummy, smoothing the silk down across my collarbone with her thumbs. She pinned the shoulder strap with a long pearl-headed pin she kept between her lips. She stood back a step. She tilted her head. I stood very still and tried not to breathe too deeply. You are exactly her height, my mother said. Exactly her shoulders. Exactly her rib. Stand a little straighter. Now turn. She walked around me the way I had seen her walk around brides in our kitchen, with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes half closed.
Good, she said.
Good. The bodice is right. The hem is right. Only the ribbon sits 3 millimeters too high on the left. Thank you, my love. You may take it off now. I took it off, very carefully, and folded it on the table the way I had seen her fold things 1,000 times, in thirds. I did not look in the mirror as I took it off. I did not want to see what the silk against my skin would have made of my face. I folded it and I went back to my homework, and I did not think about it again until the next afternoon when she called me into the workroom again and asked, in the same quiet voice, whether I could come back tomorrow at the same time, and the day after that, and the day after that, and whether I would mind if she used me for the next 2 or 3 weeks as her fitting model until the piece was finished. I said yes.
I do not remember why I said yes.
I think I said yes because she was my mother, and because she looked tired, and because this is the part one have only been able to say to myself in the last 3 or 4 years, and only late at night, I wanted to. The wanting was small and quiet and unexamined at the time. I did not know that I wanted to wear her silk. I only knew that when she pinned the strap and stepped back and looked at me with that half-closed professional gaze, I felt seen in a way I had not been seen before, and that the feeling did not frighten me. It felt, in fact, like being held. I did not know, then, that this was the first turning point. I did not know I was keeping count. Looking back now, I see them in a long, slow sequence, like beads on a thread my mother might have chosen. The moments when the world shifted half a degree and never quite shifted back. The first real shift I remember clearly came 3 afternoons later, when, in the middle of a fitting, she murmured to herself, and to me, that the ribbon should sit lower in front. She unclasped the small bow under my chin and straightened the lace, and her thumb brushed the side of my neck, just below the ear. I flinched a little. She did not notice. She went back to pinning. But the place where her thumb had been stayed warm for a long time, and I remember standing at the bathroom mirror that evening, after my shower, pressing my own thumb to that same place, almost guiltily, almost in wonder, and thinking, with this strange hyperclarity of adolescence, this is what her hands have been doing for 30 years. This is the work. This is the cloth. And this is the body underneath, and the body underneath is mine, and I have never felt so much inside my own skin. I was very careful with that thought. I put it away. I went down for dinner and ate everything on my plate. In the second week, Marian phoned. She was asking my mother how the work was going, and my mother told her, in her low, careful voice, "It is nearly there. Your uncle-in-law has been a star. He holds very still." Marian laughed, on the other end of the line. "He has always held still for you," she said, "even as a baby in the pram. He would sit and watch the wheel of your sewing machine for 40 minutes. My mother laughed too. I was standing in the kitchen with the phone held against my ear after Marian had rung off, and I had not realized I was crying until I felt a tear fall onto the back of my hand. I do not know what I was crying for. I think I was crying because Marian still knew me, even from 400 miles away, and she did not yet know what I was becoming, and I did not yet know either, and there was something safe about being seen by the person I had been a year ago, before the silk, before the camera, before the long hours in her workroom. I do not know what to call what I was becoming. Even now, with the years between us, I do not want to give it a label. I only want to say that the workroom changed me and that I did not resist it and that the change has been, I think, the most important change of my life. By the 3rd week I had begun to notice things I had not noticed before. I noticed that my mother, when she was working, often hummed a soft tune only she knew, and that the pace of the hum matched the pace of her needle, and that when the needle slowed down, her breath slowed down too. I noticed that her fingers, when she was measuring, could tell a difference of half an inch by touch alone, the way a piano tuner can tell a difference in pitch, and that this kind of knowledge lived in the bones of her hands and not in her eyes. I noticed that the silk she used for lingerie was always softer than the silk she used for any other purpose, and that she handled it differently, more slowly, with a kind of reverence, as if she believed that any piece of fabric meant to sit close to a woman's skin must be touched with the same tenderness you would use to touch the woman's neck. I did not yet know what I was learning. I only knew that I did not want to leave the workroom. There was a turning point near the end of the third week that I think about often. My mother's cousin Lily, who kept the pharmacy 2 streets over, came by unexpectedly one afternoon to drop off a prescription and let herself in with the spare key she had been given for emergencies. She walked straight down the hallway and opened the workroom door without knocking, because she had been doing exactly that for 30 years, and there I was, standing on the little platform my mother kept beside the cutting table, wearing the nearly finished camisole and a half-tied robe my mother had been adjusting at the sleeve, with 2 pins still in my right shoulder, and my mother was knelt behind me, doing the hem. Lily looked at me. She looked at my mother.
She did not gasp.
She did not laugh. She simply put the prescription on the table, said lovely color, rose, suits him, and walked out and closed the door behind her. The moment was small. The moment was enormous. Lily, I understood later, had decided on the spot that what she was seeing was a son helping his mother with a fitting for a difficult commission. She had decided it was not her business. She had decided not to make it strange. I do not think I have ever loved another human being as much as I loved Lily for those 3 seconds of not asking. My mother did not say a word. She kept pinning the hem. After a moment she said, in her low voice, almost absent-mindedly, "She won't mention it." Lily has the kind of discretion people our age earn once, and only once. Then she went back to the silk. I kept wearing the camisole for the rest of that afternoon. I stood in front of the long mirror in the workroom when my mother turned to fetch a fresh pin, and for the first time I looked properly at myself in her silk. The bodice fell in a soft V. The lace at the bust caught the late light. The hem sat just above my knee. The reflection was the same reflection I had always had in my school uniform, in my winter coat, in my gym shirt, in my pajamas at night, and yet, somehow, the reflection had moved half a step away from me, and was looking back at me with a small expression on its face I could not quite read, an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been recognition, and I did not know then that this was the moment my life changed its center of gravity. I only knew that I had to look away before my mother turned back. When she turned back, I was standing straight. When she straightened the shoulder strap, I did not flinch. When her thumb brushed my neck again, the second time, I let it stay. The piece was finished at the end of the 4th week. My mother wrapped it in tissue, then in muslin, then in brown paper. She wrote my aunt's address on the label with a special pen she kept for important packages. She put it by the front door. She sat down at the kitchen table. She drank a cup of tea. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said in her low voice, "There is one more thing. Sit down." I sat down. She said, "I know I asked too much of you. I know you came into the workroom because you love me. I know that you are not, in the way the world counts these things, the person this piece was made for. And I know, my darling, that you did not mind." I did not say anything. She said, "I would like to keep that last silk. The piece we did not end up using for the hem finishing. I would like to put it in your drawer in your bedroom, not mine. I would like you to keep it. Not wear it.
Not show anyone.
Just keep it the way you might keep a photograph. Is that all right?" I nodded. I do not remember whether my voice worked. I think it did not. That night I found the silk folded in my top drawer. It was the length of a woman's forearm, soft as a breath, ivory with a single French knot in one corner. I put my hand flat against it the way my mother had laid her palm flat against the silk on the carpet that first morning. I felt, with the strange clarity of late adolescence, that I had been given something I did not deserve and did not know how to hold. I slid the drawer shut. I sat on the edge of my bed. I did not cry. I did not laugh. I sat very still. 2 days after the package was mailed, my mother received a phone call from my aunt, late in the evening in our time, early in the morning in Lisbon. I could not hear what my aunt said, but I saw my mother's face as she listened, and her face was the face of a woman hearing something beautifully unexpected. When she put the phone down, she said, very quietly, "She says it fits."
She paused.
She said, She says her friend wore it the entire evening of the anniversary. She says she wore it to bed. She says it made her feel, for the first time in her life, that she had been seen by a stranger a long way away who understood the shape of her body without ever meeting her. She said, "That's the work, my love. That's the only thing I have ever known how to do." I nodded. I took the empty teacup out of her hands and washed it in the sink. I let the water run for a long time. I did not know, yet, that I had just absorbed the most important lesson of my working life, which was not about fabric at all, but about attention. I think what I had been feeling in the workroom, the heldness, the being seen, the quiet permission to be looked at, was the same feeling the woman in Lisbon had been feeling, a long way away, with the silk against her skin. My mother had been teaching me, through her hands and her measurements and her long patient afternoons, that being seen by another human being is a kind of fabric too, and that a well-made piece of it lasts longer than any silk. I was 16 when my mother finally admitted, in a quiet voice at the breakfast table, that her right eye was nearly gone. She said it the way she said everything, as if it were a measurement, as if it were a fact of physics, as if it were not, in the way the world counts these things, the slow narrowing of her world. She said the optician had given her a stronger lens, but the lens made the colors wrong, and she could not, with the colors wrong, tell the difference between ivory and cream, which in her work was the difference between finished and unfinished. She said the next commissions would have to be in plainer fabrics, in cottons and wovens, in things her fingers could identify by touch alone. She did not say that she would have to stop. She did not say that her hands had begun to shake in the mornings. She only said, after a pause, that if any future commission came for lingerie, her last real speciality, she would have to ask me to try things on again, and that she would understand entirely if I said no. I said yes. I did not have to think about it. I did not have to look at myself in the mirror first. I said yes because she was my mother and because the silk was still in my drawer and because the workroom by then had become a place where I was allowed to be looked at and where looking at me was not a problem. I do not know why I am telling this story now. I think I am telling it because Lily died last winter at the age of 83, and I went back to our small town for her funeral, and when I walked past the chemist 2 streets away, I realized I had not been down that street in almost 16 years. I think I am telling it because my aunt in Lisbon phoned last spring to say that she had been writing a small memoir of her own for her granddaughter, and a whole paragraph in it was about Rose's last camisole, and she had asked my permission to use my name. I think I am telling it because my sister Marion, in her last letter, called me her brother, and then, on the same page, in a separate note she had tucked inside the envelope, called me her sister, in a way that felt neither joke nor correction but simply a fact she had finally put on paper between us. I think I am telling it because my mother died 3 years ago, in her sleep, in her workroom, with her hand on a half-cut piece of cotton, and the funeral was small, and the vicar at the church where she had been married asked whether anyone would like to say anything, and I stood up and I did not say anything, and that is when I knew I had to write this down. Let me go back to the workroom. My mother's eyesight worsened through the winter of my 16th year. She took on fewer commissions. She started to forget, sometimes, which piece she had cut and which piece she had only imagined cutting. She started to lay out her fabrics in the wrong order on the cutting table, with the lining on top of the outer and the bodice under the sleeve. I began, slowly, without any formal conversation about it, to arrive at the workroom earlier in the afternoon and to stay later. I began to lay out the fabrics for her before she arrived. I began to pin the patterns for her. I began to cut, very slowly and very cautiously, the simpler pieces, the linings, the hems, the cuffs, while she watched, and then to bring her the cut pieces to baste on the machine because her fingers could still find the seam even if her eyes could not find the bobbin. I was not, in any marketable sense, learning to sew. I was just learning to remember. I was learning to stand in a workroom at 3 in the afternoon with my mother's fabrics laid out in front of me and my hands in the right positions, and to know which piece she would ask for first, and which piece she would want last, and which piece, if I cut it wrong, would break her heart. I was learning the language of her attention, the way you learn a language by living in a country where it is the only language spoken. I was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to sit in a room with another human being and let that human being be the center of the world for an afternoon, and not need to be the center myself. There was another turning point I want to mark, somewhere in the middle of that winter, because it is the moment I began to realize I was not the only person my mother was looking at. Cousin Lily came by again one Friday afternoon to drop off a prescription she had been promising for 2 weeks. She knocked this time. My mother opened the door, and Lily stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and she looked at me very carefully. I was on the platform, with the camisole half-pinned, my mother kneeling behind me, and after a long moment she said, "He has your shoulders, Rose. He has your hands. You are making another one, aren't you?" My mother nodded. Lily nodded. The door closed. I stood on the platform. My mother went back to pinning. I do not know whether my mother understood, that afternoon, that Lily had given us a small unofficial permission to keep going. I do not know whether Lily understood that afternoon that she was also giving me a small unofficial permission to keep being myself, even though she had never asked me what that self was. I only know that the permission felt, in my chest, like a small clean breath, and that the breath did not leave me for the rest of the afternoon. I look back now at that afternoon the way I look back at my mother's hands the morning I sat down beside her on the carpet. Both moments feel much smaller in memory than they felt at the time, and both moments feel, in memory, much larger. I have the impression, looking back, that I have been standing on a small platform in my mother's workroom for almost 30 years, and that I have only just stepped off it. There was an evening, that same winter, when my mother came into my bedroom without knocking. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in my school clothes, half dressed to go down for dinner, and she was holding in her hands the camisole she had finished for the Lisbon Commission, the one we had mailed 3 months before, which she had somehow retrieved from her sister's parcel of returned thanks. She said, "I want to show you something." She said, "I want to show you what your Aunt Lucia wrote on the inside of the wrapper." I did not know there was writing inside the wrapper. She crossed the room. She sat down on the edge of my bed. She unfolded the muslin, then the tissue. There was a single line in my aunt's careful handwriting, for my sister, who can sew a wedding night out of thin air. "Carry her hands with you always." My mother folded the tissue back over the camisole, very slowly, and she put it in my lap. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. After a long moment she stood up and walked to the door, and then turned back and said, in her low voice, "I have been thinking. I think I would like to teach you how to cut a piece." I nodded. She nodded. The door closed. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time with the camisole in my lap, and then I slid open the top drawer of my bureau, the drawer where I had been keeping the small silk square from the first fitting, folded into 3, untouched, uncreased, and I put the camisole in beside it. I shut the drawer. I sat for another long time. I was not yet able to put words on what I was feeling. I was only able to feel, looking back at the door through which my mother had just gone, that the corridor between my bedroom and her workroom had, in the last year, become the longest corridor of my life, and that I was not yet at the end of it, and that I would probably never quite be at the end of it, and that there was a strange peace in knowing that. The fear started, properly, in the spring of my 17th year. I cannot date the fear exactly. I know only that it arrived in my body before it arrived in my mind. I began, for no reason I could name, to swallow hard before entering the workroom. I began to flush, in the warm afternoons, with a heat that had not been there before. I began to clock the way my mother's hands moved across the silk of a piece, and to wonder what it would feel like if other hands moved that way. I began to wonder, with the confused dread of late adolescence, whether what I had been feeling, quietly and privately, was something I ought to be ashamed of. I began to lie in bed at night, and run through the afternoons one by one, testing each one for the precise moment my face had gone pink, the precise moment my hands had trembled, the precise moment my breath had not come, and to wonder, this is the part one could not say out loud for years, whether my mother had noticed. Whether she had noticed all along. Whether the question she had asked that first night, would I mind if she used me as a fitting model, had been a question in which been hiding, for years, a much smaller and much harder question of her own. I think she had noticed. I think she had noticed from the first afternoon, when I had stood very still and held my breath while she pinned me, and she had decided, quietly, not to ask. I think she had noticed because she had spent 30 years putting her hands on women's bodies, and she knew, in her bones, the difference between a body that was offering itself and a body that was simply being held. I think she had decided, that first afternoon, that what I was offering her was the offering of a son who loved his mother and not something else, and she had been willing, out of love and out of caution, to take it at that. I think she had been quietly protecting me from the question for almost a year by the time I began to ask it of myself. I want to say here that I do not know if this is true. I was 17. I was reading her gestures through my own fear. I could have been wrong about all of it. I think now it does not matter whether I was right. What matters is that the fear moved through me like a tide through a long inlet, and the inlet was my mother's workroom, and the workroom was where I had stood on a small platform in her silk, and the silk was the softest thing I had ever worn, and the wearing had, in some private deep place, begun to reorganize the rest of my heart. I started to pull away in small ways. I stopped going to the workroom every afternoon. I started to make excuses.
School.
Homework. A headache. My mother did not question me. She nodded, each time in her low, quiet way, and then she went back to the cutting table, and I went back to my room, and the door between us stayed closed for that afternoon, and the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. 2 weeks into my pulling away, she did something I did not expect. She left a small envelope on my bureau one evening, with my name on the outside in her round, careful handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. On it she had written, in her usual way, no capitals, no punctuation, short as a measurement. I have been thinking that I will not need to ask you again for a while. Your Aunt Lucia has written to say she will come and visit us in May, and we will fit her in person. I hope this is a relief to you. I have been thinking that perhaps I have asked too much. I have been thinking that perhaps you have a small modesty. I did not see. I have been thinking that you must tell me if I have made anything harder for you than I knew. I have been thinking that you are still my son, and that the workshop will still need you sometimes, and that the needing will not be the same as it has been. I love you, Rose. I sat with that envelope for a long time. I did not cry. I do not think I needed to cry. I felt, instead, a small hard knot of something loosen at the base of my throat, and the loosening felt, strangely, like a forgiveness I had not known I owed her, and a forgiveness, I realized a moment later, that I had also owed myself. I went down to the workroom that evening. I did not say anything. I sat on the tall stool in the corner, and she went back to her cutting, and the soft hum of her voice returned to the room, and I listened, and my hands were folded in my lap, and my shoulders were not pinned, and the silk was on the table and not on my body, and this, somehow, was exactly what I needed. We did not speak of it. The evening ended at 9:30, as it always did, with her closing the workroom door behind me and saying, in her low voice, "Good night, my love." I said good night back. In the months that followed, I went back to the workroom less often, and I did not put on the silk. I helped my mother with the cutting and the pinning of lining pieces, and I sorted her thread, and I fetched her tea, and I learned very slowly how to baste and then to thread a bobbin and then to sit at the machine and let the needle go through fabric at exactly the right pace, so the seam came out even, the way she had been doing it for 30 years. I did not put on the silk. I did not ask why I did not put on the silk. I only knew that what I had begun to feel for the workroom was no longer located under my skin. It had moved up into my hands, into my shoulders, into my eyes, and I was not, in any visible way, the person I had been on the platform a year before, and yet, in some other way, I had never been more myself. My Aunt Lucia came in May, as she had written that she would. She was a tall, soft-spoken woman who smelt of cigarette smoke and lavender water, and she had been living in Lisbon for almost 20 years, but she still held her knife European style at dinner, and she still used my mother's name in the diminutive, and she still, when she walked into our kitchen for the first time that May, reached up to the shelf above the fridge and took down the sugar tin without asking, because she had done so since she was 6. She wore small gold hoop earrings, and she wore, at all times indoors and outdoors, a small gold locket at her collarbone that had been my grandmother's. She arrived on the Thursday. On the Friday morning my mother pinned her, in the workroom, for a small fitted blouse she had promised to make her for the anniversary party she was hosting back in Lisbon. I sat on the tall stool in the corner. I did not put on any silk. I watched my mother pin the bodice of the blouse against my aunt's shoulder with the long pearl-headed pin between her lips. I watched her step back and tilt her head and look, half closing her eyes, the way she had looked at me a year before. I watched my aunt stand very still on the small platform my mother kept by the cutting table, and I watched the blouse sit perfectly against her shoulders, and I watched my mother's hands smooth the fabric down across my aunt's collarbone with her thumbs, and I felt, with a strange adult clarity I had not had at 15, that what I had been part of, in this room, a year earlier, had been a wedding of a kind between a mother and a son, and that the wedding had been quiet and long and full of silk, and that it had changed me, and that I had been allowed to walk out of the workroom the year before the wedding finished, and that my walking out had been the right thing to do, and that I had not, in any moment, ruined the ceremony. On the Saturday morning, my aunt asked me to walk with her through the small park at the end of our street. We sat on the bench by the pond. She smoked a cigarette. She looked at the water for a long time. Then she said, in her slow accented English, what no one else in my life has ever quite said to me, I know what your mother asked of you last year. I know you stood on the platform for her. I did not say anything. She said, I am not asking you to talk about it. I am telling you I know. I nodded. She said, I have known since I was a girl. I have known in myself the way a piece of clothing can sometimes take care of a piece of a person that no one else knows how to take care of. I have known for many years that what a piece of fabric can do for a quiet boy is not what most people think. She smoked. She looked at the water. I am not telling you what you are, she said. I am not asking you what you are. I am telling you that I see you. I sat very still. I was 16. The locket at her collarbone caught the morning light. She said, I am also telling you that if you ever want to learn embroidery, I will teach you. If you ever want to learn how a seam can keep a secret across 3 postal codes, I will teach you. If you ever want to learn how a woman your age in Lisbon learned to wear what she wore the night she was married, I will tell you that story too. But not today. She put out her cigarette. She stood up. She took my arm. She walked me back to our kitchen. I remember very little of the rest of that weekend. I remember that my mother made 3 cups of tea at once and put them on the table in front of my aunt and me, and that my aunt held the cup in both hands and looked at my mother with a look I had never quite seen before, a look that was partly love and partly the look of a woman who understood something about her older sister that her older sister had never quite understood about herself. I remember that my mother, that afternoon, asked me to fetch a fresh bobbin from the cabinet, and that when I went to the cabinet I opened the wrong drawer by mistake and saw, for the first time, the inside of my mother's lingerie drawer, and that inside were 7 or 8 pieces, in silk, in cotton, in lace, all carefully folded in tissue, all labeled in her small round handwriting in pencil. Rose's work, for Elsie, for the Salzburg bride, for the optician's niece, for Marielle's anniversary, for my own, and that the last label in the drawer said simply, for him. I shut the drawer. I fetched the bobbin. I brought it to my mother. I sat on the stool. My aunt picked up her cup. The afternoon went on. None of us said anything else about the drawer. I have never, in 15 years, told my mother I opened it. I have never, in 15 years, told my mother I saw the label.
I have never needed to.
The label was not a sentence. It was a permission. It was a permission my mother had been carrying for 15 years, quietly, in a drawer, for the son she had been quietly aware of for 15 years, and the permission had been the only permission either of us needed. I think this is the 3rd or 4th turning point, depending on how you count them. I think it is the one that most changed the meaning of everything that came before it. I went to university that autumn. I studied textiles. I did not study them because of my mother. I studied them because by then I had begun to understand that my mother had been a textile artist her entire life, and that almost no one in our town had recognized it, and that the recognition was, in itself, a kind of fabric, and that a well-made piece of it lasts longer than any silk. I wanted to learn how to make the recognition. I wanted to learn how to weave attention. I did not yet have the language for any of these things. I only had the thought. At university, I met my first friend who had any language for who I was. Her name was June. She was studying textile conservation. She was 5'2" and very fierce. We sat next to each other in the Dyes and Morton's lab in 2nd term, and within 10 minutes of being introduced, she said, without looking up from her microscope slide, "You learned to sew from your mother." I nodded. She said, I learned to sew from mine. We did not, for almost a year, say much more than that. But we understood, sitting at benches side by side, that we were both children of women whose hands had been pressed against our shoulders for many years, and that the pressing had taught us things we were still learning to put into words, and that the words would arrive eventually, and that there was no hurry. There was no hurry. There was, in fact, a kind of permission in the no hurry, the same kind of permission Lily had given my mother and me 3 years earlier in the doorway of the workroom. June became, very slowly and very quietly, the first person in my life with whom I did not have to perform. I do not mean that I wore silk in her presence. I did not. I mean that I did not pretend, in her presence, that I had not worn silk in my mother's workroom for most of a year, and that the wearing had changed me, and that the change still lived somewhere in the lining of me. I went home for Christmas. My mother had finished the Lisbon lingerie commission months before, a second piece, in cream silk this time, with small French knots my aunt had specified in her careful letter. The piece had been mailed in November. My mother had not told me how it had gone. When I walked into the kitchen on the first evening, she was sitting at the table with a small piece of paper in her hands, and when she heard the door close, she looked up, and her face was a face I will remember for the rest of my life. She was smiling. She said, "Your aunt says the cream version fits better than the ivory. She says the recipient wore it to her second anniversary dinner. She says it was the only new piece in her life that year." I sat down. I made tea. I put my hand, very lightly, on her hand on the table. She said, after a long pause, "I have a question for you." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been thinking all year about whether to ask you. I have decided to ask you, will you make the next piece with me? Not with me beside you. With me sitting in the chair. I will tell you what the piece is and how the measurements work, and you will cut it and I will watch. And if you cut it wrong, I will tell you, and you will cut it again, and we will both accept the second cut as the piece that was meant for the room." I sat with her hand under mine for a long time. Then I said, "Yes." I do not remember exactly what the piece was. I remember only that it was in cotton, in a soft blue that my mother had chosen because her eyesight, in the late afternoons, could still tell blue from gray. I remember that I cut the bodice on the second try. I remember that my mother did not flinch at the second cut. I remember that the piece took 3 weeks to finish, and that for the 3 weeks I sat at the machine every afternoon for 2 hours, and my mother sat in the chair beside me, with her hands folded in her lap, and that her hands only trembled once, on the third afternoon, and that I noticed, and that she noticed me noticing, and that she said in her low voice, "Please carry on." The piece was finished at the end of the 3rd week. My mother wrapped it the way she always wrapped things, in tissue, in muslin, in brown paper, and she wrote the address on the label with a special pen, and she put it by the front door, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she drank a cup of tea. Then she said, "I think I am done with commissions. I think I would like to teach the women of this town in our parish hall how to mend their own clothes." I nodded. She said, "Would you come and help me? I would like you to come and help me." I said yes. I said I would come and help her. I did not say that I had already been helping her for 3 years, and that the helping had been, in itself, a small education, and that the small education had been, in itself, a long quiet fitting for a son who had been folded into his mother's hands one afternoon and had never quite unfolded. I went back to university in the new year. I graduated 2 years later, with a degree in textiles and a small thesis on the keeping of late-career seamstresses' pattern notebooks by their adult children, which I had written in my mother's workroom, with her permission, sitting at her cutting table, while she sat in the chair beside me and quietly watched. June came to the graduation. My mother came to the graduation. My Aunt Lucia flew in from Lisbon. Marion came down from Edinburgh. We stood in the quadrangle afterwards and took a photograph in the soft June light, and my mother put her arm